Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Today, we welcome another author in our series every Friday that we're on, Margot Morrell, author of Shackleton's Way, Leadership Lessons from the Great Antarctic Explorer. Margot, welcome. And I'm super excited to have you because I love that story about Shackleton. I've watched documentaries about him. And to have you on and read that book, boy, I'll tell you, you cannot put that down. And this guy was really amazing. So I'm so glad you brought him to life in this book and gave us leadership lessons. So why did you write this book and why this particular title?
Well, I came across a story by chance in 1984 at the Boston Public Library, and I'd started out my career as a researcher and librarian, so I had the skills and the tool set to be able to pursue this. I was just so intrigued by this story of basically doing the impossible that I just kept pursuing it. So first I collected and read every book that I could get on the topic. Then by the early 90s, I started spending my vacation time going to London to pursue, to seek out primary source documents. 1995, I went to the Antarctic for the first time, and that led to transcribing a number of diaries from the expedition. And bizarrely, that all came to the attention of the Wall Street Journal. And by the time the article appeared the next morning by 9 o'clock, I was getting calls from editors saying, do you want to do a book on the subject? And my response was, well, how do you write a book? And so it took about a year, but I figured it out. And the next, here we are.
And why this particular title?
Well, the funny thing was, but the morning that article appeared, about 6 people called me saying, well, you're writing a book called The Shackleton Way. And I said, well, it doesn't say that in the article. And, but here we are. And one day, fast forward a year or so, Stephanie and I had a contract with Viking. And I was standing at my kitchen sink doing some dishes, and this image from the Endurance expedition came up into my mind of the wake of the Endurance. And I thought, it shouldn't be The Shackleton's Way. It should be Shackleton's Way, which is much more about going through life and making changes and wending your way through.
Yeah, I love it, and it's a great story. And I guess the time you went to Antarctica wasn't quite like Shackleton experienced, right?
It certainly was not. Though the first time I went was through New Zealand and Australia, and the point was to get to the Ross Sea, which is the lowest point, the farthest south you can get to in Antarctica, and that's where the polar expeditions in the early 19th century left from. So I got to see Scott's hut, and I got to see Shackleton's hut, and got a sense of what the situation was like for them, what life was like for them in the Antarctic.
So there was no Hilton there for them or a Four Seasons for them to stop by, right?
I always joke about that. And no Ritz on the Antarctic plateau.
Yeah, I wouldn't be doing that trip if it was me. I'd have to wait till somebody like Shackleton actually did it. So glad he did. So what are the three things you would like readers to walk away with from this book?
Well, I think to me, the story is a metaphor for the challenges that every single one of us face in life. And I think that to me, the ultimate takeaway from this story is you can be, have, or do absolutely anything you want in life. It's just a matter of saying to yourself, am I willing to pay that price? And that's the sum total of this story. But what I was interested in was, there were wonderful books that were written about Shackleton. The first book I picked up was Frank Worsley's book. Frank Worsley was the captain on the Endurance. And he wrote a wonderful book called Shackleton's Boat Journey. And then Alfred Lansing came along in the 1950s and wrote his masterpiece, Endurance. And then Roland Huntford wrote a fantastic 800-page biography of Shackleton in the 1980s. But what I wanted to know was, how on earth did he manage to do this? How did he manage to get this group through this incredible ordeal? And that's what I set out to figure out. And what it comes down to is he uses four strategies, and those are leading by example. He never expected anyone to do anything that he wasn't willing to do himself, communicating effectively, keeping up morale, and maintaining a positive attitude. And that is essentially how he got through this incredible ordeal and led his team through it.
Well, we're going to dive into some of those topics, but let's talk a little bit about Shackleton, because he was really a rock star in his day. I mean, he was a world famous guy. Was his father or any family members seagoing people?
No, his father was actually a physician. He was born in Ireland, and his father decided to become a physician, and they ended up moving to London. So he was, interestingly enough, he's always considered an outsider. He always is. He signs every letter he ever writes to his wife, Mickey, which is a slang term for Irish. And so he always saw himself very much as an outsider, which is kind of interesting. But all of these polar expedition leaders were rock stars. You know, everybody knew their name. It was the equivalent of being a NASA astronaut in the 1960s, or, you know, today, one of the technology leaders. You know, we all know the names, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs. It basically was the equivalent of that.
Wow. And it was super impressive. Again, anybody who hasn't read her book, got to get this book. What was he like, and what were his interests?
Well, everybody who ever knew him in various walks of life would refer to him as the life of the party. He was very gregarious, very outgoing. He was a lot of fun. He, on the first expedition he went on with Captain Scott, he actually made the suggestion that they write a magazine to keep everyone entertained and involved during the course of the winter months. You know, it's pitch dark for 24 hours a day for 4 months down in the Antarctic. So this was just a way to keep everyone involved, everyone doing a project. When he leads his first expedition on board the Nimrod, he actually brings a printing press. He sent a couple of the guys to learn how to print, and they actually print a book while they're in the Antarctic during those cold and boring winter months. And those books are the most valuable books of the polar. I mean, they go for, you know, $60,000 or so today.
So no internet, no Netflix, no Amazon Prime, nothing.
Nothing.
So, yeah.
But they do have a printing press, and they do have typewriters.
You got to use your imagination. That's what it looks like. I think, like many, assume the crew are sailors and a few executive officers. What were the specialists on a ship like Shackleton? Because I was really amazed when I read the book.
Well, I think if you think of the Big Bang Theory, you know the television show, The Big.
Yeah.
Those are the people he had on board with him. I mean, they're not the specialists on board. He had a biologist, he had a meteorologist, he had a geologist, he had a physics expert. So they're all and the other thing you have to keep in mind about these, he didn't expect to have this group with him the entire time. Some of the people were going to go back to South Georgia for the winter. Some of the people were going to stay in a cabin in the Antarctic for the winter, but he wasn't expecting to have 28 people with him the entire time. But he has a photographer with him, a motor expert. So he has a lot of people with varied forms of expertise.
Wow. And we have a question here. Did he establish a hierarchy among the group? You talk about communicating effectively. Was there a pecking order?
You know, yes, and no. Yes, in the sense that if the group had a problem, if the crew had a problem, like the sailors, they went first to Cheatham, and then they went to Wild, and then they went to Shackleton. So there definitely was a very established, just like there would be in the military, very much an established order. But the other thing about it was everyone pitched in. One of the interesting things that interviewers asked the survivors in the 1950s was, was there a hierarchy of this group? And everyone pitched in, everyone had to do everything. In fact, two of the people who had, primary input, how to put it, they'd gone to Cambridge. I mean, there's a physicist, they thought they were above doing any of the hard work aboard the ship. And the first thing they decide to sleep in the mornings, and Wilde goes and puts a hose through the window, and the message is clear. They are not, nobody is sleeping in. Everybody is up and contributing, and everyone has to do everything.
You wrote on here in the book that he did not put up with any kind of prima donna, and he was not a prima donna himself.
Absolutely not. Yeah, but when you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is the morning after they abandon the ship, he gets up, he probably hasn't slept all night, but he gets up and makes tea for the crew and goes around with a couple of the other people and delivers hot tea to every cabin.
So let's talk about and go back a little bit. Tell us about the two expeditions to the Antarctic on the Nimrod and Endurance, and why his fascination with the Antarctic.
Yeah, he leaves school at 16, kind of like Winston Churchill. He wasn't much of a student, but interestingly enough, after he leaves school, he proceeds to educate himself to the point where he could recite pages and pages of poetry, which I always say it's like the equivalent for boomers of being able to recite the Beatles lyrics.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's not a slacker at all. But anyway, he decides he doesn't want to spend his life in the office. He wants to be out and about. And on the first ship that he's on, it goes around the world, and they get to Cape Horn. And as he says, writes in one of his books, I felt strongly drawn to the mysterious South, and that's where he finds himself. And he keeps promising his wife, like, this is it, I'm not going back again, but he keeps going back. That's what pulls his heart forward.
Yeah, again, these are impressive stories that you tell. What was his leadership style, or are there any famous leaders you see today that resemble him?
I think the best example of Shackleton style leadership was when President Reagan, during the assassination attempt. First of all, he insists on walking into the hospital on his own, even though he collapses the minute he gets through the door. But he's leading by example. He wants the country to see that he's okay. He knows that there are cameras around. Secondly, he communicates effectively throughout that afternoon. He jokes about it. He jokes to his wife using an old line from a boxer, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And he says to the doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." And he maintains a positive attitude through the whole thing. So, and he's keeping up morale. Everything he does throughout that incredible ordeal. The bullet was only an inch from his heart. I mean, it was a very serious situation, and he manages to joke his way through it. And that is Shackleton in a nutshell.
Ronald, I hope I'm saying this, is it Ronald Edmondson was the first to the South Pole. He and Shackleton paired in notoriety, to Scott, one of our listeners puts. What is the connection between fame and leadership?
Well, it's Roald Amundsen, who was a Norwegian explorer Interestingly enough, Roald Amundsen had exactly the same situation that Shackleton found himself on board the Endurance. But in 1898, he was trapped on a ship in Antarctica in the pack ice, and they actually managed to get through. But that was an incredibly it was the complete opposite in that one of the men on the expedition writes, the darkness right near but midwinter's day, they call it. The darkness grows daily a little deeper, and the night soaks hourly a little more color from our blood. Most of us have grown tired and gray, though few of us are over 30. There's an absence of jest and cheer and hope. Meanwhile, 17 years later, aboard the Endurance, Frank Hurley's writing in his diary, "Party time! We're having." Or Macklin is writing poetical verses, and I am doing the same. McElroy is creating a décolleté, meaning a low-cut dancing rig, and Uncle Hussey is being beset by applicants to accompaniments on his banjo. So the contrast is so stark between Shackleton's style leadership and this other leader aboard the Belgica.
Interesting. How did he sell his vision? Because he raised the equivalent of like $10 million for his ventures, or at least actually even one, right? Just the Endurance he raised, if I read that correctly in your book. How did he sell his vision to people?
Well, people were always impressed by him. There was a steel maker who, great businessman who commented about his qualities. As he got to know people, they were impressed by him. And he had a great way of connecting with people that he used on the Endurance and all his expeditions. And one of them commented, it's, these personal conversations that were the glue that held this group together. And that was, they all commented on how he would just strike up a conversation. And your question is making me think that, he probably did that with the people who could be his donors, that, it's just a matter of getting to know people and connecting with them so that they would, he could go to them and say, would you be interested in financing this expedition?
What was this like? Were they like angel investors? Did they expect to get a return on investment?
Some of them did, and some of them didn't. So, and he was. This is interesting because he wasn't particularly good at nailing down the details. That wasn't who he was.
He was a big picture guy, right?
Yep. He could have used a lawyer. like put this in writing. So, because one of his major donors on Endurance had died in the interim, and of course, to him it was a gift. The donation to Endurance, whereas to the executors and heirs, it had been a loan. So he would have done well to have nailed down those details.
Wow. So before you talk about the tragedy and ultimate success of Endurance, can you talk about, he created products? Like I remember reading in the book that he would even tell other explorers, and we'll talk about that later, but he would even tell other explorers, I could give you good advice, but I can also tell you about the way to pack, what kinds of things to take. And he even had some, I guess, kind of inventions that he created as he adjusted to the climate.
Yeah, absolutely. He didn't get along particularly well with Scott, and yet he was perfectly willing to offer Scott some excellent advice that Scott would have done well to take when Scott was planning his discovery expedition. So he was very generous in offering advice to other explorers, and he's amazing in the way he was always forward thinking. One of the big perils of polar expeditions was scurvy. Nobody on Shackleton's expeditions ever got scurvy because he was so forward thinking in terms of the food that they ate. And he for the endurance expedition, he actually went to Germany to seek out somebody who was, again, very much forward thinking in how they were designing food. So he had these quote unquote nut bars that were part of their diet and got them through, in fact, their ordeal. So he was very forward thinking.
So let's talk a little bit more about what his men endured, such as the cold, the long polar nights, their diet. I mean, we can barely survive COVID here, and we've got all the amenities. But he and his people managed to keep their sanity and health through unbelievable, you know, barriers and so forth that he had to go through. I mean, it was incredible. So talk about what they were actually going through, how cold it was, everything that they were dealing with.
Well, on the polar plateau, it gets to be minus 40 degrees. But they typically dealt with temperatures that were more like minus 10 or because they never got quite that far south. But the big problem is, the boredom and the the darkness of being pitch black for 4 months of the year. So he insists that everybody get together and spend the evenings together in the on the ship. And Ordleys, who signs on to be the motor expert, but is an utter failure in that particular role, actually writes in his diary right around New Year's of 1914, we're supposed to have a corroboree, meaning a sing-along tonight. It didn't come off. Thank heavens. I hate those things. A year and a half later, he's living under 2 overturned lifeboats on a deserted island. Nobody's going to find them there. Shackleton has left 8 weeks earlier. He's overdue to come back and rescue them. And Ordleys writes in his diary, "We had a grand concert tonight of 24 turns, and so ends one of the happiest days of my life." It just shows the camaraderie that Shackleton built in his crew, that everybody had to contribute, and a song, a poem, something on these celebrations that they had, and that was how he kept the crew's spirits up.
But you write in the book, though, he was very selective of the crew members, and that probably tells us why. What was the profile, the kind of crew members he was looking for, along with all the other people that accompanied him?
Well, one of the things he always said was that loyalty trumped everything in his perspective. But he was really looking for people who could get along. James, who was a physicist on board, famously told about his interview with Shackleton, and Shackleton says to him, "Can you sing?" and James, who, top flight physicist from Cambridge University, like, "Can I sing?" And what Shackleton is looking for is, like, can you get along with people? And that's what he's really looking for. Can you get along? And that's, of course, what he's emphasizing with, you get kind of the subtext of the Ordleys comment, like, I want you to participate. I want you to contribute to being a whole group, not breaking off into small groups.
Hence, Sheldon probably wouldn't have made it as one of his star physicists, right? On there.
Well, the thing is, he did have and that's exactly the thing. And when they lose the endurance, he actually takes the 3 most difficult personalities, the Sheldon, who is Reginald James, into his own tent. And the 3 guys who are involved have no idea what's going on, but everyone else on the expedition knows exactly what Shackleton has done. And through taking the Sheldons into his tent, it's like, holy cow, wow, that is so amazing that he would do that.
And this was not a hard sell to get people to want to come to the Antarctic with him. How many applicants did he have?
There were thousands of applicants when he first announced the Endurance expedition in late 1913. But it was, interestingly enough, Dr. Macklin told the story in the 1950s of how he had managed to go. He'd always, it was a time when polar expeditions were a big deal. And Macklin, like a lot of the others, like Shackleton himself, probably grew up reading these stories of these polar expeditions. So Macklin, the minute the expedition is announced, Macklin writes a letter to Shackleton, and he doesn't hear anything. So finally, he decides, like, I'm going up to London myself. I'm going to, present myself at the expedition and see what that happens. So he walks into 4 New Burlington Street, and there's Shackleton running down the stairs as Macklin is going up, and Shackleton says, Macklin says to him, like, here's why I'm here, and so on. Like, great, go upstairs, get to know the guys. I'll be back in the afternoon. So that's exactly what Macklin does. They go out, he gets to know the other guys, they go out to lunch together and chat and so on. Macklin, by the way, is a physician at this point, and he's probably 23 or 24 at the time. And when Shackleton comes back, he calls Wild into the office for a few minutes, and basically, obviously, is saying to him, what's he like? You think he'd be an asset? Can he get along with people? And that's and then he calls Mac in very brief conversation, like, you're hired.
Yeah, I
So
thought
it's
was
that determination that is really the determination and the initiative to go down to London that really impresses Shackleton. Like, you're hired.
and essentially almost everyone. He was like one of the older guys at what 35 when he was leading the Endurance, and everybody was in their 20s except for one guy who I think was 50, and he selected him for a specific reason. Why? Who was that? And why was it?
I think you might be talking about the carpenter McNeish, who
Yeah, yeah.
he's one of the older people. Shackleton, actually, at the time of the Endurance, is 40 years old.
Okay.
He and Wild and Worsley, Frank Wild is the second in command on Nimrod, basically on Endurance, and then later on Quest too. And Frank Worsley are all around 40 years old. A bunch of them are in their 20s, and a few in their 30s or so. Yeah, but why did he hire McNeish? McNeish was amazing. He never measured anything. He could look at whatever he needed and eyeball it precisely. And he was one of these grumpy people who was always looking would get drunk on Saturday nights and go looking for a fight, on a ship. That he was going to have to deal with everyone, for the going forward. It wasn't like he was going anywhere, and yet he made a major contribution in decking the James Caird and in raising the sides of the Caird. So
But he was also like a calming influence as well, right?
not McNeish. Wild was very much a calming influence, and could he was people were always praising Wild for the addition that he was to the expedition. And that's amazing, because he manages to keep everybody every day on the well, he's left in charge, of course, on Elephant Island when Shackleton goes off to South Georgia to seek help. And Frank, after about 2 weeks, when they can start to think that Shackleton might be coming back for them, every morning, Wild says to the group, "Lash up and stow, boys, the boss may come today." So again, it's, very much like, everything's everything's even tempered. At one point, 2 of the men get involved in an argument, and Shackleton and Wild comes along and says, "What's going on here, boys?" And they say, "Well, we're arguing about women's hats." Of all absurd things. And Wild, like, really? And makes them shake hands, and like that's the end of it. And to think that he manages to get this group, for 4 months almost through this being on with very little food, very few ways to resupply their food supply. And yet they are having a remarkably good time, to the point where right towards the end, before Shackleton comes back, a couple of them are building a snow maiden of the, as they put it, of the well endowed by nature type. Again, you're like, who would have thought it possible that a group of people could get along so well and have so much fun?
And what was the diet that they ate? Because you said they didn't get scurvy. So what was the diet?
Well, Shackleton insisted that they all eat fresh meat, which was penguins and seals, primarily. That's what's available in the Antarctic, and that's what keeps them from getting scurvy, and keeps them. And he brings an incredibly varied diet with them. You know, like jugged hare is one of the things they have on board with them. That always strikes me as, amazing. So he feeds them as best as possible. But when they first bring the seal on board to have seal stew, the sailors push back on that. And he makes it very this is for the officers, the officer deck. So the sailors actually come to him and say, well, if the officers are having it, essentially we want it too.
Smart psychology.
Exactly.
Yeah, really smart psychology. And we have a question here from a Naval Academy grad. When Shackleton was stuck in the ice with his expedition and drifting with the ice, he could and did establish his latitude by stellar observations. However, is that an era before radio navigation systems, Loran, Omega, and way before GPS? How did he determine what longitude was at? How did he determine longitude?
Well, they had Worsley. Worsley was incredible at taking a sun sight with a, now the word's going out of my mind. It's not a compass. It's a, somebody else knows the words, just going out of my mind. But anyway, they would get a sunshot, and they had the books with them, and he could go through the books and make
calculations. Is it called sextant? SEXTANT?
Sextant.
Sextant, yeah, it's called a sextant.
Scott Witt, thank you so much.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm a sailor. And the practice is called celestial navigation.
Yes, thank you. Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. And what was the diet that they ate when they were going across the ice? Because when you talked about what happened, I guess, with the Nimrod, and they were eating ponies or something, right? Did I get that right? Did I get the right trip?
A Nimrod expedition. Yeah. Shackleton took ponies with him, which, it seems bizarre to us, but in fact, it was a more efficient way to travel. And these ponies were Russian ponies, and they were adapted to being in this weather. And it was bizarrely, it was a much more efficient way to travel than with dogs. The reason for that is out of my head at the moment, but if you read the book, it's in there. But Shackleton, they had, again, he'd very efficiently packed the food supplies. On Nimrod, they actually lost one of the ponies, that was the problem with the ponies, that they were not as efficient in going over the ice as the dogs were. So they lost a pony with some of the food supplies down a crevasse. And the polar plateau is actually 2 miles deep. So these crevasses were unbelievably deep. They just, something was gone if you fell down it. So they really had to eke out their food supply. And that's one of the most amazing. So they get within 90 miles of the pole, and at that point they turn back. But Wild says if Shackleton had only had himself to think about, he actually would have kept going. and then they turned back. It's the equivalent of slogging from Boston, Massachusetts to like Charlotte, North Carolina, carrying all of your food supplies with you and everything else that you need. So on the way back, they are extremely low. They have actually laid depots so that they don't have to take everything with them. But they, at one point, Shackleton, and I think this gives you an idea of exactly who Shackleton was. Wild was very sick. And one morning, Shackleton takes his one biscuit and forces it on Wild. And Wild says, writes 30 years later, that gesture, I'll never forget about it. It was just so incredibly generous. And the way he talks about Shackleton is just so incredibly impressive. But I think that moment on that expedition shows you exactly who Shackleton was.
Yeah, Shackleton even said, if you don't eat this biscuit, then I'll bury it in the snow.
Right.
And yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. What were the ingredients to his success? You wrote about this. What were the ingredients to him?
Well, I mentioned earlier, it was these 4 attributes of leading by example, communicating effectively, keeping up morale, and maintaining a positive attitude. It's those 4 strategies that really are the secret to Shackleton's success in getting this group through this incredible ordeal.
Yeah. How did he manage to keep his men thinking positively? Because he had worked with some guys who weren't positive thinkers like him. And they called him boss. They didn't call him captain, which I thought was kind of interesting too.
Well, he wasn't the captain. Frank Worsley was the captain of the Endurance. Shackleton wasn't, he actually bizarrely didn't regard himself as much of a seaman. In fact, when they take the James Caird from Elephant Island to South Georgia, if being a seaman had been the criteria, he wouldn't have been on the boat. It was the fact that he was really the leader, which was completely different situation. Yeah.
Understood. Just like a captain, I guess, on a crew, somebody owns their own ship and has a crew and a captain with it. You wrote about the officers supporting him. What were they like, and how did Shackleton lead that he got such great support? How did he interact with his own officers to make them feel like they were, almost equals in a sense?
Well, it really was from the moment they from the moment they were trapped in the ice, it becomes essentially a shore station, so that the hierarchy completely collapsed. But I think what you're asking for in a bigger sense is, for example, when they actually had to abandon the Endurance, what he does is stand very visibly on the deck, as somebody said, with a serious but unconcerned attitude. And as everyone leaves, he just kind of pats people on the back or says to them, hey, don't forget your diary, be sure to take your banjo. To everyone who goes by, he says something, and they have this, again, sort of strong personal connection with Shackleton. And then after they leave the ship, he actually calls them all together and gives what one calls there's nothing said about it. It's not elaborate at all, but he very, says like, this is how we're going to get through it. And then a couple of weeks later, he happens to notice that the Endurance is actually sinking. And so again, he kind of calls everyone together like, hey, look, the ship is actually sinking. And one of them says it must have been an incredibly terrible moment for him. And yet when he turns around and sees the worried looks on the face of his men, he says to them, so now we'll go home. And in that one short sentence, he gives them a goal and a positive outcome, and nobody panics. Everybody like, yeah, now we'll go home.
I set everybody up for what happened. I mean, how that ship ended up sinking, and how things kind of went sideways for them.
Well, the funny thing was yeah, as it had happened before in the Antarctic that a similar situation. So they, when they get down to their goal, which is a place called Bassel Bay at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. And that's where they plan to make what Shackleton calls the last great polar journey, the crossing of the Antarctic continent. So they get down there and a summer storm springs up. And when the storm clears, they are trapped in an ice floe. So for the next 9 months it is, the winds and currents push them north. And they think that they probably are going to break out. The ice is going to melt to the point where they can, get back on with it and head north again to resupply. But just as in late October of 1915, just as they think that the ice is about to loosen up and free them, disaster strikes. And there's a storm far to the south of them that they can't even see. And next thing they know, the ice floes which weigh thousands of tons, are pressing against the ship. And the ship, and despite valiant efforts to save the ship, they are sinking. So,
What's the ship made of?
oh, it's wood. Yeah,
Because I thought, the Titanic was made of steel, and he was one of the people that gave them an opinion about what the captain did right and did wrong about the Titanic. So I kind of assumed it was made of steel back then, but it wasn't.
No, not this. Actually, the ship was the Fram, which was Roald Amundsen ship, was actually shaped like that, so that when the ice, if the ice froze, and in fact they kept their ship down there, it would actually just come up under the ship. But the Endurance which was actually built for polar outings, expeditions in the Arctic, actually had a little bit of a grip to it. So that's what happened, and it caught the back and twisted it, and they couldn't save it.
Well, what were the keys to Shackleton's resilience, and how did he teach or show his men how to be resilient?
I think he always, he, of course, these great Shackleton quotes, optimism is true moral courage. On the Nimrod expedition, in early December, he already knows that it's probably going to be impossible to reach the South Pole. And he writes in his diary, difficulties are just things to overcome after all. One of my favorites is, a man must set himself to a new mark directly the old one goes to ground. And so he just has this very positive, he loves the poetry of Robert Browning, and he says what he sees in Browning is this spontaneous optimism that he's very much, that's the core of who he is. His favorite hymn is Lead Kindly Light. Amid the encircling gloom, lead kindly on. He has a tremendous faith. When they abandon Endurance, when he calls the group together, he very visibly, to model the behavior, he tells them we're going to have to reduce our belongings to 2 pounds apiece. And to demonstrate that, he takes his grandfather's gold watch and throws it on the ice, and a handful of gold coins. And then he very visibly takes a Bible that Queen Alexandra has given the expedition, and carefully slices out a couple of chapters from the book of Job and the 23rd Psalm. And those are the valuable assets that he's taking with him. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
I thought it was really interesting that the more famous he became, the more equipped he was at handling that, and the more humble he became. And he was like a superhero. to people and to his men. He gave people a lot of time when they wanted to talk to him and ask him questions. I mean, he was just an extraordinary individual based on what I've been reading in your book.
That's
Um,
one of the things that people said about Reagan too, about Shackleton. It comes up all the time with, they treated everyone the same. Everyone, whether you're the King of England or a sailor, you treated everyone exactly the same with honor and distinction.
You write about his various skills at handling crisis, breaking bad news, bolstering his morale. What could leaders learn from him that would have made them more effective during this pandemic?
Well, I think that keeping up morale and really, the power of the personal connection is so important with Shackleton, that staying in touch with people and not in a, you don't have to overthink this at all, but just that ability to stay connected. And one of the big lessons I've learned from Shackleton, was the power of the personal interview. If you want to get something done, go and see that person. And that's a great Shackleton lesson.
Um, Shackleton came from a very big family dominated by women. I think he had 7 sisters, if I'm correct. How do you think coming from a large family, especially mostly made up of women, affected him?
Well, he actually said, there's something of a woman in me, interestingly enough. And of course, there's the great description of him as a Viking with a mother's heart. And wouldn't we all want to be described in exactly those terms? And one of the interesting things, here we are talking about 100 years ago, and he very much encouraged his sisters to have great careers, to pursue their interests. And one went on to be a nurse who rose up to the top of her profession. Another was a chef who rose up to the top of her profession. Another was an artist. So he really encouraged his sisters to pursue their interests and have great careers.
Isn't there a story about him having to go over a mountain to get to the rescue town? Is there a story behind that? And I think you talk about that in the book.
That's my favorite moment in the expedition. Shackleton takes 5 of the men and sails from Elephant Island to South Georgia. They land on the wrong side of South Georgia because Shackleton refuses to take the risk of the currents pushing the ship, the boat past South Georgia. They won't be able to get back. So they land on the wrong side of the island, the uninhabited side. And they take about 2 weeks to recover from the boat journey. And then Shackleton and Worsley and Crean set out in the middle of the night to do the impossible, which is to cross South Georgia. And they keep going back. They keep getting lost in this, so they have to backtrack about 3 times, which must have been heartbreaking. The mountains, I think, about 5,000 feet high. So they cover 30 miles in 36 hours. It is considered virtually impossible. Some of the best climbers in the world did it a number of years ago, and it took them 3 days to do the same thing. Nobody has managed. I don't think anyone has managed to do it in 36 hours. But at one point, they have been going for and Shackleton allows Crean and Worsley to sleep. If he had gone to sleep, that would have been the end of every single one of them, not just the men on South Georgia, but the men on Elephant Island too. And the incredible discipline, and he says it was the thought of the men back on Elephant Island that kept us going. What that must have taken to allow the Crean and Worsley to go to sleep, even for just 5 minutes, to refresh themselves while he stood watch. is just unbelievable.
I also thought it was very interesting, as ambitious as he was and as risk-taking as he was for himself, he would not do that to his men. If he thought, he would not put them in any danger or anything unnecessary that would put them at risk. Am I correct about that?
You're absolutely right about that. One of the things, you know, these are young men. A lot of them are in their early 20s and they do goofy things like play around on the ice floes. And Shackleton comes along and happens to see them, and he's you know, irate that they are risking their lives unnecessarily. And that's one of the things they would say about him was he loved to be called old cautious. He
Yeah.
referred to himself as old cautious, not that anyone else ever thought of him exactly that way, but he never took unnecessary risks at all.
You wrote about his apprenticeship. That's how he kind of got into the being seafaring. What did he learn that molded him into the man he became? And do internships hold that same value?
Well, I think internship, you can see, you know, by being a, by um, noticing things, by being watchful, you can see, you can learn a lot of lessons from being an apprentice. And what he learned was on the first ship he was on was that he really admired the captain of that ship, who had the apprentices for dinner on Sunday evenings. Again, sort of building that camaraderie. Isn't it interesting that that was such a big deal with him going forward? And the next ship he served on, the captain wasn't like that at all. And he noticed that the difference in the results that the first captain got versus the second captain. And he very clearly modeled himself on that first captain he had.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. Do you think Shackleton's later love of education, especially reading, contributed to him being a well-rounded leader? And how important is reading to being a leader?
Well, I think um, one of the points you're making there, I think, is he constantly learned, he constantly
Yeah.
thought about his leadership, and he wasn't the leader on the Nimrod expedition that he was on the Endurance. He is constantly learning, constantly fine tuning, and constantly polishing his leadership skills. And I think that's one of the lessons that we can all lead. You know, we're going to make mistakes, but we can all, you know, learn and improve as we go along.
Uh, as we're wrapping up here, one of the things I thought was amazing parts of the book was the prediction of wireless phones by one of his crewmen 100 years in advance.
You know, that's interesting. I mentioned earlier that Ord Lees was signed on to be the motor expert and was a complete failure in that role. Hurley, who was the photographer, actually took on that role. But what Ord Lees was interested was in the food supplies, and comes to Shackleton and says, "Hey, can I be in charge of the food supplies?" And Shackleton's like, "Sure." And in that role, he was incredibly helpful in eking out their food supply. Again, contributed to everyone's survival. But one of the things that goes totally unnoticed almost about Ord Lees, who's kind of, if anybody had been left behind, it probably would have been Ord Lees if Shackleton had. And in fact, Ord Lees writes in his diaries, I kind of had a chat with Shackleton today. I said to him, I almost missed the ship. And Shackleton's response was, "How I wish you had." but Ord Lees starts this diary as a letter to his wife. And he maintains this very intimate, like, gee whiz, I wish I'd paid attention to how the floors were washed at home. You know, here I am washing the floors, like, of all things, and so on. But so he maintains this very particular, to the point where he's writing to, at one point, I've always been interested in the leaders of these polar expeditions, but one can't get a very good impression from the book written by the leader himself. I hope, therefore, that this portrait of Sir Ernest will be of some interest to someone someday. And so here he is making a contribution that's almost unrecognized for 100 years, and that he's very much documenting Shackleton's leadership. And that was the first one of the diaries that I transcribed, and it's essentially a treatise on Shackleton. It's over 500 pages, and it's really a lot about Shackleton's leadership in these various situations.
So the Secretary of Navy, and this will be the last thing, which Secretary of Navy actually gave this book out to naval leaders and was a huge fan of Shackleton?
You know, the book came out 20 years ago, and I'm getting a little rusty.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I think he was might have been under Clinton,
Yeah.
and he was the Secretary of the Navy, and he just gave this book out about Shackleton so everybody learned what kind of leader he was looking for in the Navy. He felt this guy was the perfect role model. Well, I want to thank you, Margot, for taking the time to speak with us today. And your book is fantastic, and you're a great storyteller. And so I thank you again for sharing the time today with us, and hope to see you all next week when we have our next author. Everybody have a great weekend. Stay safe.
Thanks, Mark.
Take care.